The past year has been filled with fallout and consequences from the news of sexual harassment in the workplace. In fact, just this week, the news out of CBS continued that pattern that we continue to see. The Me Too movement has increased the attention and sensitivity of harassment in the workplace and provided another opportunity for more transparency and discussion. If you attended our Women of Influence event, you have heard some version of this next part already, but I think it's important for helping frame up today's discussion and the reason that we are here today. Recently, John Oliver, on his weekly HBO show, tackled the topic of Me Too. The episode was a deep look at the topic of workplace sexual harassment and featured an interview with Anita Hill. Hill, you'll remember, came forward in 1991 to accuse U.S. Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. She testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee for 8 grueling hours. Thomas was ultimately confirmed for the court where he now sits. In the episode, Oliver made the somewhat obvious statement that workplace sexual harassment is not new. He lamented the fact that we've had surges in awareness in the past, but that it often fades into the background, only to resurface again in the future. In addition, Oliver shared candidly about not speaking out when he had seen workplace harassment in the past due to power dynamics that made him too afraid to do so. He'll proceed to give him advice and also give advice to others that are in that situation. Today's event on Me Too in the workplace is our effort to help ensure this important topic doesn't fade, and our effort to capitalize on the increased attention to make sure that both men and women have the tools and best practices to confront this. But here's the reality: this is a really tough topic. It's complex, lots of different shades of gray, and it can be uncomfortable and hard to talk about, and also hard to wrestle with individually. But I don't think no progress has been made, and I don't believe that this is the same as the surges in the past. And while we won't discuss every aspect today or come close to solving the issue, I know we've got a great group of panelists here today that are going to help us start to unpack this a little bit and help turn the attention of today into a positive for our employees and for our workplaces going forward. So with us today, directly to my right, is Karin Johnson. She's a partner of labor and employment for Faegre Baker Daniels. Next we have Kirsten Anderson. She's an advocate and founder of Equitas Solutions. Jon Couture, Chief Human Resources Officer for Principal Financial Group, and Tiffany O'Donnell, CEO of Iowa Women Lead Change. As a final reminder, this is a Q&A with the audience, and so I'm going to open it up for questions from all of you. And like I said, this is a tough topic, and so what I would encourage is sometimes when it comes to tough topics, it can feel a little bit tougher to get that first question out. It's always tough to get the first question to begin with, but I'd encourage you to go ahead and move forward with that. If you've got a question, I'd really appreciate you raising your hand and coming forward with that question and pushing through that uncomfortableness. We'll all be better for being able to hear that question. So with that, our first question, one of the toughest things I think about this topic is, we talked about how broad it is, but there's so much nuance in the actual situations that can occur. So I think it's important for us to spend a little bit of time on the ways that this can manifest and the different types of situations that can crop up. Karin, could you provide us an example, or could you each provide us an example of a situation and what we could learn from it? And I think that would be a good starting spot for us today.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Go ahead and pull it.
Yep. Yeah, so rather than speak about a personal experience, I'd like to come at this question more from a professional perspective. So I've been representing employers in employment litigation like sexual harassment lawsuits for over a decade, and what I've learned through that experience is that it's actually very difficult to establish legally actionable sexual harassment in court, and I know we'll have an opportunity to talk more about that as we progress through this discussion today. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind that when we use the phrase sexual harassment, that has a legal meaning, and then that has kind of the meaning that most, in the way that most of us are use that phrase. So in order to be legally actionable, harassment needs to be severe or pervasive, and it needs to be both subjectively and objectively offensive. And the courts, I can give maybe just one example to illustrate that will make this point a little bit more clearly. There's a Seventh Circuit case where the fact pattern was as follows. There was a supervisor who had allegedly made inappropriate comments, including that the plaintiff in that case was, quote, made for the backseat of a car, looked like a, quote, UPS driver, and looked like a, quote, dyke. He also allegedly said that he hated pushy and aggressive women, such as the plaintiff. But the court in that case decided that that alleged conduct did not rise to the level of legally actionable sexually harassment, and that lawsuit was dismissed. And I'm not making any commentary on whether I think that's right or wrong, but that's the state of the law. So it's a very difficult thing to establish.
Kirsten?
The personal example I wanted to give today has to do me being a victim and now choosing to be an advocate. And as I thought through an example I would share today, what I felt might be most important for employers in this day and age is to think very carefully, do a lot of strategic development and self-examination of your own organization, because in my situation, when I knew I was being harassed and retaliated against by my employer, I did my due diligence. I dug out my handbook, my physical handbook, and when I went through it, every other page was missing. So I checked around, and all my coworkers, every other page was missing in their physical handbook. This was before it was online. So think carefully, re-examine what your policies are, be prepared, make sure that your employees know where the policy handbook is, what it says, and how to help other people get to it as well. In this day and age, it's all online anyway, but it's also important to update those policies too and have those at the ready. So that's my example for today.
Jon?
So my example would be a category of problems that we see primarily in work environments. So just a question for all of you: how many of you in your work environments have social functions, sales conferences, etc.? Just raise your hand up. Right. So pretty much everyone's hands are raised. One of the things that is a big issue for business is the behaviors that happen at those events, particularly when there's alcohol involved. And to me, that's a giant issue for companies. It's a giant liability for companies. And the answer to reducing the instances of really stupid behavior at those things, that's a technical HR term, is to set expectations with folks for behavior. You want to enable people to have a good time. You want people to act like adults. Inevitably, some folks won't act like adults, and so it's really important for leadership to set expectations for behavior at those events. And then when issues actually happen, it's really important to hold those employees whose behavior is totally inappropriate to complete account, without regard to their performance, their contribution to the company, etc. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later, about the issue of when you have a high-performing employee who is a bad actor in a company, and the company's hesitance to act on that person because they don't want to lose the sales or the revenue, despite the fact that the person should be gone.
Tiffany?
Okay, so examples. Okay. Anyway, okay. Well, we all have. I know a lot of women in this room, and we all have all kinds of stories we could share. At Iowa Women Lead Change this year, we really focused on working together with our male allies, and I just want to. What my hope is after today is that we will leave here with the confidence and the courage to know that it's okay, whether we're a woman or a man, to step forward when we see something that's not right. And I'll just share with you, I like to share the good examples, which was pretty courageous. I was in the news business for a very long time, /entertainment. So you can imagine it's one of those careers a lot of people want to get into, kind of hard to get in. So once you're in, you want to really protect your spot. You don't want to be a troublemaker. This was a long time ago, before Me Too certainly was ever even thought of. But there was a video of me as an individual in high heels walking, and this was back when, this will really date me, but we had an off-air monitor in the newsroom that we could see. It wasn't aired publicly, but one of the video editors was watching that video forward and back. forward and back, over and over again, watching me walk. Kind of creepy, truthfully. Well, the news director, a gentleman, and this would have been the mid-90s, which gives you an idea. This was a good human, and that's the other lesson. Just be a good human. It's just that easy. But he happened to see that and went into the room where this video was coming from and took this kid and slammed him against a wall. And as a young woman, you know, we just sort of navigate. None of us want to be victims, so we just sort of navigate this terrain all the time. We don't even know when we're doing it anymore, but it made me feel so, you know, empowered, proud, that this boss, I mean, I didn't know him, we weren't friends personally, but my boss saw that this was inappropriate and stepped forward to do something about it. You know, fast forward to just, you know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago at an event, news director who ended up getting, no one ever fires him, even though he was suspended and no one knew why, which is another legal question we can discuss. But we were at a social, and my husband happened to be there, and this manager of mine came and sat almost on my lap. And when we got home, my husband came over. I was sitting on the bed, and he came over and he sat almost on my lap. And he looked at me and he said, "That is not okay." And I think for me, again, that was obviously my biggest male ally and my husband, but it really speaks to how really strong individuals can be victims of this. And we all need to be self-aware, you know, men and women, and step forward and be courageous enough to call it out when we see it. And that, you know, my hope today, if we can leave here today all feeling that much more empowered to do that, I'd be thrilled.
Except for the physical violence piece. Little qualifier. That's why we got HR needs.
Yeah, I know. That was the mid-90s.
You know, I think collectively, as you look through some of those different examples, Karin, I wonder if you could go a little bit deeper into the difference between sexual harassment versus what's acceptable at a company, and how do you try to define as a business what you accept and don't accept? I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about that, and then maybe Jon too, from your perspective.
Sure, of course. So I think a lot of, you know, the employers that I work with rightly focus their policies on, you know, what's a respectful work environment versus, you know, how far can employee take his conduct before it crosses the line into something that's legally actionable. But, you know, kind of going back to my opening remarks, when it comes to, you know, how you can win a claim for sexual harassment, the courts expect people to put up with quite a lot of, you know, the ordinary workplace garbage. You know, not all of that is actionable. So there, you know, there are a lot of offensive things that happen in the workplace. There are lots of rude people, but not all of that gives you the right to bring a claim in court. So, you know, kind of the legal catchphrases again is that, you know, conduct has to be severe or pervasive. And it also needs to be offensive both subjectively and objectively, you know, so offensive to the reasonable person, whomever that is, in order to be legally actionable.
Jon, from HR standpoint, what type of approach have you tried to take?
So I like Tiffany's approach. I think we're going to, at Principal, Kim Miller, our employee relations leader, is here today. We're going to revise our policy to say, hey, just be a good human. But our policies, seriously, our policies basically align with what Karin talked about in terms of we want a workplace that is free from harassment, intimidating, or offensive behavior. We don't specifically spell out exactly what that looks like, but we set a standard for what that behavioral expectation is. And then we work hard to ensure that throughout all of our people systems, so the recruiting process, our onboarding process, how we train people, how we develop leaders, at each part of that employee life cycle that we embed that behavioral expectation in terms of what that looks like. And then we have the back end processes to make sure that when there are problems, employees feel comfortable reporting those issues, and we have a very quick, effective response to those in terms of how we investigate and resolve those issues.
is there a point where you decide when it needs to elevate? And I struggle to sometimes to, again, in that understanding whether it's actionable. How do you decide what level to take something to when you're in that role in HR?
So when you say level,
How would you address the situation if it comes to light? Especially if it's one where it's not legally actionable.
yeah. So again, we work to have an environment where we encourage employees to raise issues that are inappropriate, and there's a number of ways that can happen. They can call HR. They can call. We have an anonymous ethics line. We have a board. People know how to reach our board directors. So there's any number of ways that an employee can reach out and raise a grievance. Once that grievance is raised, we have a great team of employee relations professionals that investigate that issue all the way through to resolution. So if it's an accusation and it's he said, she said, whatever the story is, we'll get to the best version of the truth that we can through an investigatory or an investigative process. And if it raises up to a more serious issue, then we address that issue. We may have to, depending on the issue, bring in either internal or external counsel. So I think the key is the commitment to ensuring that there are mechanisms available for employees to raise issues. Employees, number one. Number two, employees feel comfortable raising issues. And there's a difference between those things. You can have mechanisms, but a culture that doesn't encourage people to raise issues, and you're probably not going to make much progress if that's the case. So I think it's having the mechanisms, having the culture, and then having the machinery in the company to make sure that you can investigate these issues fully through to conclusion.
And I might add, just Chris, if you don't have the leadership, it's kind of a waste of time. If your leadership doesn't really walk this walk,
That's right.
it doesn't really matter.
From your perspective of having been a victim, and you've talked about how you'll have to help me with the stat, but 90% of incidents are going underreported.
Right.
And so
91% of incidences are never reported. That's according to the EEOC, and that's a staggering number. So you instilling a culture of comfort and confidence is really key, and that top-down leadership mentality is huge, because if your leaders aren't walking the walk and talking the talk at the same time, then you will always have a broken system within your organization. Yeah.
what are some of the factors that perhaps lead to that being underreported?
There is a huge stigma associated with this topic. It can be embarrassing and shameful. I felt it. It's taken me years to be able to speak to a group like this about this issue, because for a lot of career-driven women, you think you can handle everything, right? And I didn't even tell my spouse what was going on for fear that I was keeping it together. I was a career woman. So that level of confidence and comfort, I also felt I didn't have anyone to turn to and talk to. We did not have an HR professional on our staff, so that was another problem. But that is huge, and the fact that we're all talking about it, that's progress. But we need to eliminate the stigma all around, and quite honestly get comfortable talking about it in our homes, with our friends, with our coworkers, if we're going to eliminate this problem altogether.
Tiffany, you alluded to being labeled backgirl, I think is the term. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and continue to help us understand when somebody's dealing with that, what they're feeling.
Yeah, it still exists. I mean, I know I'm not going to expect people to raise their hands, but just think in this room where we have strong leaders, I mean, how comfortable really are you? I call it DEFCON 2 going to HR. In my experience, that was DEFCON 2. And what I've seen work really well in organizations is when they have an intermediary. You mentioned the anonymous line. I would have been more comfortable calling that number than going to HR, just because I had seen what happened. you know, I hadn't really seen I hadn't seen reporting be successful. You know, I just saw, you know, somebody reports, then they become a pariah in the workplace because everybody knows that they're, you know, talking badly about everyone's boss. So it really, you know, I feel like, you know, having a third party before that HR level is one of the best practices and has been one of the most effective that I've seen.
And I'm going to come back to that because yesterday when we were talking a little bit, there was some, not disagreement, maybe disagreement.
It was.
It was disagreement.
It was
Disagreement, good.
John wasn't shy about it.
Let us be
Yeah.
clear.
We're next to each other.
So I'm
We
going
did
to come.
respectfully disagree.
I'm gonna come right back to that, but before I do, and what I told them is that we haven't had a fight yet that broke out up here. So maybe this is our closest. But before I come back to the disagreement part, when we're talking about some of the factors that lead to the lack of reporting, how much do you think it is partially that gray area and rationalizing certain behaviors that prevent not only the victims from coming forward, but also the bystanders from saying something? I'm not sure if I'm directing it to anybody in particular.
So I can jump in, and I go back to what Kirsten just said. To me, one of the biggest things that we can do as leaders is establish a culture that enables us to have conversations about this. So where Tiffany and I disagreed is, I think having an intermediary between HR and an employee doesn't address the fundamental cultural issue. So if we have cultures in our companies where we encourage people to talk about these issues, even these difficult, uncomfortable issues, if we're enabled to have these discussions and work through that discomfort, I think we take a big step forward at reducing the statistic that Kirsten shared around these issues not going reported at all, because people don't feel comfortable either bringing them up to anyone, and especially not into an official complaint or grievance system.
If I can jump in on that too, I would just add that from a legal perspective, when you add that an additional layer, you know, I would question a little bit, what is that person's role? You know, are they to serve just as a neutral peer, you know, kind of as a sounding board for people? Are they well trained in, you know, employment law or in, you know, human resources? Do they understand when to escalate the issue if they determine that, you know, it needs to go beyond them? So I don't know that I'd go so far as to say I think there's something wrong with it. I'm sure there can be good value in it, but I think if your organization is going to insert that additional layer, you just would want to be really clear to define roles.
You know, I think I should clarify though too. You know, the point that I was making was that Rockwell Collins, a huge organization, has an ombudsman, and that's the intermediary I was referring to. Which, you know, I went back and checked just to see what the process was, because those are really great points, and there is training involved. These are usually senior leaders appointed by more senior leaders. When complaints are made to them, it is discussed with human resources. It's just it's a first step. It's an easier first step, and it's a process that they've used to not only, you know, fix some of those issues, but it's also a good pulse point for them. You know, they're able to find out, you know, what is truly going on in an honest way. So that, just to be clear, you know, it was an ombudsman role, and there is significant training and processes involved.
But the goal ultimate was to try to figure out a way to make it easier because of, and
Yes.
we talked a little bit about the size of the organization making
Exactly.
a difference too.
And HR was always an option as well. I mean, an ombudsman was just one option. I mean, you could do the board, the HR, any of that kind of stuff too, but it was just one more tool that they offered.
What I'd love to do now is open up for questions, and the first hand was right here up front. So
Yeah, it was kind of piggybacking on all of this. Kirsten had alluded to they had no HR person, and it relates to who do you go to. Being a small business, I'm the owner. We have a director of operations who does a tiny bit of HR, pretty much hiring and checking backgrounds. I'm looking into getting an HR consultant, actually talking to one tomorrow. However, what advice do you have for small businesses to get something like this in place? And what would you advise for us?
Yes, I'll take that one.
I mean, I have an office of all women, so I mean, it theoretically could happen still, but you know, I would like to have something in place when we actually hire a man or something happens down the road.
God forbid.
We need to talk later.
No, so what I would say is a couple things. Karin brought up, in my experience, most companies underinvest in training. So the first thing that comes to mind is if you have an operations leader and you might not be in a position where it makes sense for your business to have an HR person, then you can still have a designated person who has that responsibility and provide that person with training. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be to create in your company that, I'm going to keep going back to the culture thing because I think it underpins everything in this space, is if you establish a culture around your, as the leader, owner of the business, your expectations behaviorally for people, and your culture also enables your employees to call out aberrant behavior, then I think we go a long way to addressing when an issue pops up. If you have a culture like that, it gets addressed, and then there are, you know, great consultants in the marketplace that can help if there are specific areas that can either do the training for you or advise you when specific issues come up.
And one more thing, you had mentioned you're in an office full of women, correct?
Yes.
Don't underestimate female on female harassment.
Oh, I know. Oh, I know.
Okay? A study, I don't know if some of you saw it last week, just came out, Queen Bee Syndrome. You will hear more about it. I promise
We've
you,
been
it's
working
a
on
big
that
deal.
culture.
So,
Trust me,
yep.
that's the culture we're working on right now. Yes.
Just to be cognizant.
Are there some other things that maybe a small business should be thinking about as it relates to this if they don't have the resource of having a full HR department?
I think the points that Jon made were really good. I would just add to that that no matter how small you are, you can always have a clearly defined policy that states to whom someone should go if they have a complaint to make.
And Tiffany, you've in talking about the ombudsman role, and in your piece that you wrote for the Business Record on this, you talked a little bit about HR. So it's good that we've got you sitting next to Jon. But
Is it really good?
if you could talk a little bit more about that, what you were highlighting in that piece about the challenge of going to HR, I think that would be an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on it a little bit too. It's just, I wish I could say we were at a place like Principal, where there is a culture top down, where it is encouraged to talk about, and it's, you're not penalized for doing so. But I think there is still this quiet undercurrent out there that, and especially, I'm so glad, Kirsten, you mentioned that women, we don't want to be victims. I mean, we navigate, and we're very strategic, and some of us have gotten really good at that, understanding that, we've had success in sort of writing it out and getting to the next level and let the guy get fired and we'll be fine. But, I still think it can be very difficult. I always knew in my role, and some of you may relate to this, until I was prepared to quit, I really wasn't comfortable going to HR, because in my view, and I worked most recently, it was a very large corporation that I worked in, basically a franchise of a large corporation. And I just knew that, I would be labeled, I would be a problem. And because I had seen that happen, if I had confidence in the culture, I would have done that. But I still felt like HR, at least in my organization, its responsibility was to the organization, not to me, at the end of the day.
More questions?
But
now?
can I just say
Yeah,
one more
yep.
thing to my HR friends? It is often, and I mean this sincerely, it is HR that is in charge of the training and setting teams up to be able to combat this. So HR professionals are our strongest allies in keeping it from getting to that level too.
More questions? And I know I have one way in the back there that patiently had your hand up for a while there.
Hi, Matt McIver with the Iowa Stage Theater Company. Back in February, we were fortunate enough to have Kirsten on a panel after a discussion of an original play that one of our resident artist company wrote called The Me Too Play. And it was an amazing discussion afterwards, but one of the things that was really fascinating and eye-opening for me, not only was the play about, and the conversation reflected how challenging these conversations can be, but also the lasting impacts of this kind of destructive behavior in the workplace on people. I believe firmly in the culture question, and we as an organization around that time adopted the Chicago Theater Standards, and we really pushed organizationally to open this up. But it opened up some conversations for us, and we heard some stories about people's situations in the past and the destructive effects that can linger on. I think that, I firmly believe culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that I know organizations are hesitant often around the idea of how those star performers, and what are we going to lose? But I think what we underestimate consistently, and I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on, is what are we losing in terms of career growth, productivity from the people who are enduring this kind of behavior and having to fight through just to get to work every day.
You lose a lot. It's years worth of damage,
Personally, the mental
toll that, I've gone through counseling, lots of antidepressants, my productivity plummeted. In fact, your company's lost productivity, there's a price tag on it. If you have one bad apple spoiling the whole group, the price tag on lost productivity is $8,800 per harassed employee annually. So if that bad apple is spoiling multiple employees, that is a huge loss in financial productivity. So that's just food for thought. John, I know we talked about this yesterday, but that star performer problem, and how does your company, or how have you tackled in the past that star performance issue when they're the harasser?
And I think also on top of that is in the economic climate that we're in, where unemployment is so low, that provides an additional piece of information to the pool that makes businesses want to lose talent even more so than maybe they did 5-10 years ago too. So John, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so just so we're clear, the star performer issue, as I mentioned earlier, Kirsten, you just mentioned it. This is the issue where you have an employee who is a great top performing delivering salesperson. In our business, it could be a great investment manager, or in any of your industries, it's like a top performing person who is a moron of behavioral. Another technical HR term. And so the answer to it is, it goes back to leadership. It goes back to taking a stand at some point, because our view, my view personally, I believe principal's view, is that even though that person may be a great performer, the damage that gets done organizationally when you have a person who is a strong performer but a poor, their behavior is unacceptable, has far more damage to the organization than the value they create from the sales they generate. So we think that's the right mindset, and that tone at the top matters a lot. So I know Dan Houston, as an example, who's our CEO, if an issue came up where there was a top performer whose behavior was unacceptable and it was proven to be unacceptable through a fair process to determine what happened, and it said, yep, this person's a bad actor, we would not hesitate to part ways with that person. And I'm proud of that, and it's one of the reasons I joined Principal, is the culture that we have. But it goes back to leadership. I know working for Dan, because that's Dan's ethics, and he knows that downstream impact, we know that downstream impact is far more damaging to the organization than that individual's contribution.
Well, we know how much it costs. I mean, we know how much turnover costs. It's ridiculous. So, yeah, in the war for talent, I mean, it's in everyone's best interest to keep your teams.
And you mentioned, I think Tiffany, it was you mentioned the number that you just left, right?
Yeah.
And so the number of times that could be happening and people don't
Yeah.
know that there's a real reason, that the real reason behind that is something negative happening in the workplace, could really have an effect. And again, the underreported part of it, that's sitting there. More questions from the audience? I haven't turned this way, so we'll go right here. Yep. Mike's coming.
To occupy my accent. Good. I am Clement Wilcox, and I am a marketing consultant. And by my accent, you may know I'm not from this country. But I want to make you aware, if you are not yet, that knowing this Me Too movement is based on power, right? And one of the biggest power people have is over minorities. And so my question is, how do you work on that? Because language will be a barrier for you to know that someone is harassing someone else, or witnesses, for example. What do you do with cultures that don't handle the same standards that we handle here? So how do you manage that power situation?
You know, I might just say, before somebody way smarter than I answers that question, we find that organizations that work with Iowa Women Lead Change, since we look at leadership development through a gender lens, organizations that are open to that discussion and doing that work in their culture tend to be really, culturally. Just want to put that out there. If you've got a good culture, it's a good culture all around.
Need more perspectives on that? It's a really great question and a tough one to to answer. But maybe John, if you've got some thoughts from HR perspective.
Sure. So again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it goes back to what degree are companies equipping managers of people and leaders in a way that creates an environment and a culture of mutual respect, dignity, all the things that we want as far as good behaviors for managers. And what I find is that if that exists, so if we're creating great managers who treat everybody equally, then that applies to everyone. It applies to minority populations, it applies to non-minority populations, men, women, different lifestyle choices. It applies to everyone. And so I think that there's not a silver bullet solution to almost anything in life, but a big step forward that companies can take is making that investment to make sure that you're clear on your behavioral expectations for employees, and you're investing in the development of your managers and leaders. And what I've seen in my career in HR, which is, I'm dating myself now, and we're talking about 30 years in the field, is that most companies underinvest in the development of these areas.
Karin, I wonder, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot because we haven't talked about something in the past, but are there any examples legally that you can think of that relate to her question?
Yeah, I can't think of a specific example, but this might be a good time just to talk about the importance of, doing thorough investigations when complaints are made internally, because I think whether you're handling those investigations, with maybe your internal HR department or hiring outside counsel to do those, one of the points of going through that process is to really try and understand everyone's perspective and how you got to this point. Now at the end of the day, as John mentioned, everyone's going to be held to the same standard, which are the company's, respectful work environment policies. But at least conducting interviews and having those conversations can help you kind of wrap your arms around, you know, what the situation involved, and you can really try to understand it.
And Chris, I think I would also add, Tiffany, you made a comment a little bit ago about the HR function in our companies are there for the company, and that certainly is true. But I would also say, at least at principle, our view is that HR is a control function, and the control function is yes we have the interest of the company in mind, but we also see ourselves as a mediator of fairness. And even if management might say, hey, we think this should happen with this employee, it's our job, my team's job, to make sure that we're saying, you know what, that's not right, that's not fair, that's not consistent. So well-run HR functions have this responsibility to be, I call it a control function, but it's a middle ground to make sure that it's fair and consistent.
It's right here up front.
Jen, as it relates to what you just said, I do think, as a female, a lot of times we feel like HR's job is to protect the company. So there's a little bit of fear of, do I really want to go to HR? Because like Tiffany said, then I'm that girl, then I'm maybe that girl. But I guess my question is, how do you make sure it gets past, when you first report, maybe it goes to this level of HR, that person doesn't want to lose their job protecting Tiffany or me or Kirsten or whoever else. What do you put in place to make sure that person doesn't go, you're a liar, no one's gonna believe you, we're done here, and then that person kind of gets shut down, and it never gets to you or someone else to say that's not right.
Yeah, I think the answer is to what Karin said, which is you have to have a rigorous, fair investigatory process. And you have to have capable people who know how to do investigations in a fair and balanced way, because our goal is to get to the truth, whatever the truth is. And then if the truth leads us to, there's nothing that, and by the way, let's all be really honest, there are instances where, and Kirsten, it's kind of what you were talking about in terms of 91% go underreported. Even when something is reported, if it's not substantiated, it's not actionable. So that's a really tough concept to grapple with. So something can happen, and it can be, a person can feel comfortable escalating the issue, but the investigation is only going to demonstrate what it can demonstrate. Sometimes investigations demonstrate, I can't substantiate the allegation, even though the allegation could be totally true. I don't have the magic bullet for how to solve that, but that's a part of the process. All we can do is make sure that we have a thorough process for investigating all allegations, and then depending on where the facts lead us, we then take appropriate action.
Karin, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe some mistakes businesses make after an allegation has been made, or somebody has raised an issue that maybe you've seen.
Yeah, so one big one, and kind of following directly from Jon's comments, is when organizations do take the step of conducting an internal investigation. I think too often they determine that a complaint was not substantiated because it was a he said, she said kind of situation, and there were no direct witnesses to what might have happened. I think in particular, if you're using an outside investigator, it's completely appropriate, and I would argue that it's wise to ask that person to make credibility determinations. If worst case scenario for an organization, if a complaint is made and is not taken seriously, and that person goes and files a lawsuit, you're not going to do well in your deposition if you say, well, we didn't take any action because ultimately this was a he said, she said situation. We are all humans. A jury's going to be asked to make credibility determinations, and you're within your rights to do that as an employer as well.
More questions from the audience? I'm gonna go. Yep, you got it. Take it.
Thank you for being here and tackling.
Mike is coming right behind you.
Okay. Thank you for being here and tackling this tough topic with us. In my experience, Des Moines has really great mentorship programs. Sometimes it's within companies, sometimes it's across industries. I'm curious for those of us, and probably many in the room, that are mentoring young women, young professionals. Some of those are female, but also males in the room are mentoring young women. I'm curious, what can you share with us? What can you recommend to us? What resources are there? And also with the side topic of sometimes the harassment is coming from a vendor or a customer, and it's not always a fellow employee, whether they be male or female.
From the mentor perspective, I can say, you're the best. I mean, you're the role model. I think sharing experiences with your mentee and how you navigated around that is extremely valuable. I think a mentor is in a unique situation too, in that they have the opportunity to have pretty intimate details about if there is a concern. And as you know, there are a lot of gray areas. So I think it would be important for a mentor to give wise counsel, knowing all parties involved. And then maybe as a mentor, your role becomes reaching out to others, certainly not exposing, what you're hearing, but maybe, you become the researcher to support that mentee. But I think oftentimes we have to see it to be it. And as a mentor, your example is perhaps most important.
The second part of Jackie's question was talking about if it was happening with maybe a vendor or somebody that's not in your business. Karin, I wonder if you have any thoughts on approaches businesses should be thinking about from that standpoint, and whether is that the business's responsibility at that point?
It is the business's responsibility, and I think, what I see is that most employers address that very issue directly in their policy. And so, if you have an obligation as an employee, if you feel like you are being, harassed or mistreated by someone like a vendor, to follow that same reporting channel and make sure that your, complaint is heard.
I imagine there would be another layer to that where if the using a sales position type and they're working with a vendor and they're being judged on how well they're working with the vendor or how many sales they're making in that way. I imagine that would put a lot of people in positions where they could be vulnerable to that type of behavior as well. And Jon, maybe from a business perspective, how do you try to protect employees on that front?
I mean, I wouldn't have anything more to add than what Karin shared. To me, it's making sure employees understand that you as a company have their back, and you expect that ethical behavior, even if it puts you in a tough position, and then encourage employees to use all the channels that are available.
So similar to being willing to lose the top performer, being willing to lose the relationship outside of the business, right?
Yeah, I mean, I call those points in time moments of truth, and you gotta stand for something.
I would hope that the sale wouldn't be worth that. I would hope that it's not worth it for the company as a whole anyway.
I can see it being a chilling effect potentially on leadership if somebody is.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I'm just wondering from a legal perspective, Karin, is it a company liable for the actions of an outside vendor?
Yeah, I think in certain circumstances, it's possible that it could be. And I think it really comes back to the company's knowledge. And so, if it's well known that a certain vendor is, whining and dining your salespeople and there's harassment occurring and you don't do anything about it, that potentially could be legally problematic. Can I impose myself as the moderator for just a second
for it.
and walk this back a little
Yeah.
bit? Because I want to touch on a really, what I think is a really important point. So the first part of your question asked about, mentor and sponsor kind of relationships. And one thing that I've heard about just in my, social circles and, speaking with other women is that there are some men, probably none of the men in this room, who have started to act a little bit skittish in their relationships with women in the workplace as a result of this Me Too movement. And I would just throw out, I think many of us have been extremely fortunate to have wonderful sponsors, and I won't single mine out, but he's sitting here in this room. And I think that, you know, sometimes the most valuable time we have with those sponsors or mentors is the, you know, windshield time, for example. So maybe, you know, in my case, maybe you're driving to an out-of-town hearing with someone, and it's just you and that other person in the vehicle. And I think that's such valuable personal time to deepen relationships. And so I think we just all, that's another kind of aspect of this whole movement. And, you know, maybe a piece of the fallout is that it's sometimes causing people to you know, take a step back in those relationships. And I just think that's really unfortunate and something we should all be aware of.
Sheryl Sandberg wrote, I think it was back last fall, about the Me Too backlash, and one of the things that she brought up was exactly this point. And the study she was citing was saying that 50%, half of male managers in the U.S. today are afraid to do a common work activity with women, like having a meeting. And so that strikes me because on one hand we tend to bucket everybody that would be afraid of doing that into well, if you've got nothing to worry about, you shouldn't be afraid. At the same time, half of people are saying that they're afraid, and probably not half of those men are actual offenders. And so that to me seems like a really interesting dynamic to be aware of. I'm just curious what your thoughts might be on that.
You know, I being out and about, in and out of a lot of different sizes of companies, I can tell you that is absolutely the case. I've had, you know, several individuals, leaders say, I don't have closed door meetings anymore. You know, we know a lot can get accomplished in some of those meetings. So that is extremely real. And, you know, it's why consultants like Kirsten, you know, are more important than ever to even find out, because what I think is these men aren't offenders, and so many of them don't set out to be offensive and harass, but they're self-aware enough to know that they don't know what they don't know. I mean, they don't know. They've seen it happen. They're afraid that maybe even just generationally, what's okay to them might not be okay. They've seen this happen. I know, just sitting here, I've touched John's shoulder several times.
And I've been very uncomfortable.
But that's exactly my point. Like, maybe I could get in trouble. You know, I don't know.
Talking afterward.
There's so many questions like that too that we sometimes don't know what we don't know, and we're just afraid.
But this also tells me, and that Sheryl Sandberg quote also tells me, as women, we need to keep talking about this. We need to stop excluding men from this conversation, include them, and say, hey John, would you mentor me? I expect this and this, and we're gonna have a good time.
And is it okay to touch your shoulder?
I know, but really, I had a gentleman, our kids played sports together. I was making a professional call with him about a sponsorship, saw him in his lobby, I hugged him, and he backed up from me and he said, wow, you're really huggy. And it really, I couldn't sleep that night. I'm like, wow, you know, it's just...
Fear is a knee-jerk reaction, and it's understandable, but that's why we gotta keep this conversation going. It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
I don't know where the mic is, but so in our organization, we call this gender etiquette. And I think that fits in perfectly with what we're talking about.
You said the word one more time just for
gender etiquette. So it's not only with male, female, it's with your LGBT, it's with, you know, various audiences. And for those, like John talked about, you can tell this makes me like get quivery because it's like kind of a hot button. I've been in HR and I've managed people as well. And it starts at the top with how you build the culture and educate your people. So for example, how many of us have walked into a room and we've said, hey gals, or hey guys, and we don't even think about that and how we come across. So it starts with a very simple greeting, how we greet others, how we interact with others. It might be two females. It might not be appropriate to hug in a business setting. So starting at the top with how we interact with others from a business etiquette, a gender etiquette, and from there it just trickles down. It's kind of like teaching a child that a knife is sharp and not using it to cut any deeper. That's the way it would start in a business setting as I would see it. So I just wanted to throw that in. It's a
a possible appropriate comment.
You know, my thought, and it's something that I've talked about, and that's why the Sheryl Sandberg one resonated with me, is that I know that as everything started coming out, I started to self-reflect and started to look internally. And what I've seen from other men perhaps is that when confronted with a lot of information really quickly, it's really easy to just pull back and not try to deal with, trying to understand where that's coming from. And I think a lot of times when that fear component comes into play, it can make certain people shut off, but it can also make other people go into hyperdrive and overthink and overanalyze things. And that overanalyzation, I think, can be a good thing, but it can also lead to the, do I hug or do I do a handshake? Do I close my door? Do I not close my door? And those are things that, if you work with us, that we've joked about in some ways related specifically to me and some of the things in our office, because those are sometimes the awkward situations that pop up that I'm now currently aware of that I wouldn't have been thinking about in quite the same way before everything was happening. Even though there's no reason for me to be concerned about that, it was in my brain. So, more questions from the audience. Yeah, Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Picorni, and I do training in this area for a long time. Question I have is I want you to address the external issues that may be impacting our work environment and culture. In particular, the toxic political environment, the comments that are made that demean women, demean African Americans, demean immigrants. To what degree, and Instagram, Facebook, you name it out there, social media, to what degree are you seeing, if any, influencing the culture, the work environment, whereby employees, people say, this gives me license to say and to do because this is what I'm experiencing out there in social media or, politicians and so on. I think that's an elephant in the room that we need to talk about. Can you speak to that? Are you seeing that happen? And if so, how are you addressing it?
I get this question as I make talks. Yes, it is a problem. But when you go to work, it should be about work, and the ancillary things should be kept to yourself. I always say, if you're not going to say it to your mother, your spouse, or your daughter, then think twice about saying it at all. But that also, I think, reinforces what we've been discussing, in that leadership needs to instill this culture of confidence and support, and that no, we're not going to talk about personal political rants at work. And that is not appreciated. You're here to do work. That type of mentality, I think that is helpful. The other thing I always say is teaching respect to each other, extending respect to each other starts in the home. And talking about it at home is also vitally important, so that you nip those types of inappropriate behaviors in the bud too. And that's hard, but it's worth accomplishing.
And I'm guessing, Karin, that's not a legal defense. If you get in trouble, you can't say, well, I hear it on social media all the time.
It is not.
I actually think it's a really great question, because my view would be what's happening in our country and to some degree in the world right now is the division that's happening is making having the conversations that are work appropriate more difficult. Because we seem to have lost a degree of civility in our conversations, which makes it harder to put difficult, controversial topics on the table, which doesn't allow us to move forward as a business, as a society, as a people.
One more thing, I also think it's okay if you experience something like that to call those people out on it. Say, I didn't appreciate that, that was not appropriate, please don't share that at work again, or please don't send me that email again, don't appreciate it. Saying it and shutting it down in the moment is also a really good thing.
Karin,
Chris, can I just follow up?
Sure.
I've had several clients tell me, ever since the campaign, the president and for Congress 3 years ago, they have seen a change in what their employees are willing to say and the words that they're using in the comments. And they're scratching their heads saying, what is going on? All right, so that's what my focus of the question is. If you're experiencing that, is it influencing? And so it's an interesting dynamic that I'm getting from employers of what they're facing.
I think it's a bipartisan dynamic.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't think it has anything to do with which administration is in or not in.
Just overall.
And then you throw in a little dose of social media, which ultimately is, again, this is my personal opinion, it drives exclusion as opposed to inclusion. So you would think that social media is a platform for inclusion and everybody's different ideas, but what has actually happened as we've experienced social media for a long time is it accelerates exclusion.
And there's been an increase, of course, in the high-profile national cases. And Karin, you talked a little bit about seeing a little bit of an uptick, I think, perhaps in some of the investigation-type work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And are we seeing an increase in reporting that reaches some of that, the unreported part, or is it the awareness that's driving that? I'm just curious if we could talk a little bit about that piece of the puzzle.
Sure. So I don't really have a good view as to whether more complaints are being made within organizations. Some of the other panelists could probably speak to that. But what I have noticed and what I do is that I'm being retained much more often to serve as a neutral internal investigator. I think that companies are taking the complaints that they are receiving more seriously perhaps, and they're showing a willingness to kind of escalate those and to retain someone from outside the company to come in and take a fresh look at the situation.
Jon, you mentioned some larger companies can sometimes are seeing that where there's more complaints coming forward. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And I know you and Jon's only been on the job of principal for 3 months, so from some perspective from your career, I think would be helpful.
Yeah. So I would I'm looking at our employee relations leader for some eye-blinking Morse code as far as. I don't believe, all joking aside, I don't believe we've seen any kind of a material increase in the number of complaints at principal. In past lives, definitely have seen a dynamic where employees, and it's correlated to kind of where the company's at and what's going on with the company, and where if a company is in distress, then I have seen an increase in employee complaints, and specifically harassment and retaliation.
Well, I would imagine if you're asking employees to be more forthcoming, that would lead to more of that happening.
And it gets to, we were talking about this yesterday a little bit, it highlights a very tricky part of this issue, because with that increase in complaint activity, there are also dynamics that happen in the work environment where employees understand that there's a heightened level of awareness in this area, and sometimes can bring false allegations. So if I'm an employee and I'm experiencing a performance issue, and all of a sudden the pressure starts to come down on me as far as I feel like my job is at risk, and I've seen this where employees will say, well, the reason I'm not performing is because I'm being harassed or because I'm being retaliated against. And in some cases, that's not true. It is just a mechanism to elongate the investigation process. But it adds a layer of complexity to it, because you also want to, every time that happens, you have to give that person a fair process. You have to take that. You can't have a culture that says, oh, this isn't a real allegation, we're not going to take it seriously. You have to take every allegation with the same degree of seriousness, and you have to apply the same resources to investigate it to get to the truth, whatever that truth is. But it adds a layer of grayness and complexity to the issue.
Karin, you had I think your phrase was, and if I get it wrong, correct me, you can't treat an employee any worse, but you don't have to treat any better as a result of the complaint. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and I think that kind of dovetails with Jon.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think the way you put it is perfect. That's my piece of free legal advice for the day. That, obviously, it's not within your interest as a business, and certainly it's not legal to retaliate against someone for making a complaint of harassment or discrimination. But just as you cannot treat a person more poorly because they have made that kind of a complaint, they also can't use their complaint as a shield in the workplace. So, my advice is that you want to be managing performance correctly all the way along, so that, I very often in my practice will see a situation where an employee or a former employee of one of our clients has filed some kind of a harassment, administrative complaint or a lawsuit, and then, I get a call that says, okay, I know we have this lawsuit on file right now, but listen to what this person has done. They haven't showed up for the last 3 days of work. They haven't called to let us know, where they are. And, at the Christmas party, this person threw a drink at someone, whatever the case may be. But they don't feel empowered to take any employment action against the person because they have this employment matter on file. So yes, in some, keep in mind you can't treat them worse, but you also don't have to treat them any better. They're two separate issues.
Right over here.
I'm glad that it's taken me a while because I've heard, there have been nuggets within each thread of questions that have come. And all due respect to your response earlier, John, is that I think kind of dovetailing off of what Kevin was saying, it is not a bipartisan issue, and I don't know that, I think speaking about politics at work, absolutely, Karin, you all made a good point about this is an inappropriate time. But we started this conversation saying, how do you handle a top performer who's a star performer, right? But who's to use your term, a moron on the behavior side. When we are in a culture right now that one would argue, our economy's awesome. It doesn't matter what kind of moron you are outside of your business practice. From a female, that's really hard to accept that we can say that. And again, all due respect, I'm sure that at Principal and in some other corporations, that's true. But I think that the question that I have is, I think that this climate that we're in suggests that yes, we are talking more about the Me Too movement. Yes, women are coming out in droves saying, this has happened to me, this has happened to me. We've gone on and said, okay, we're not going to protect the top performers. Really? And then secondly, I have to say, okay, how do you find those allies, whether they be female or otherwise, or mentors, who can help you navigate through this within your culture when the top performer is in fact being protected because of their star performance? And how do you look at this and say, well, yeah, I'll leave it there, because I think that is the elephant in the room, that we can all say that this isn't happening, but it continues to, and you have people who, even going on this most recent conversation that we've had, that would say, is that backlash, or is it you can't treat a person better or worse, but you have people, men who are afraid to step, or who are changing the way in which they do business. You have women who are also, as we've noted, in many cases our own worst enemies. How do you find the true allies to help you so that you aren't the person who says, well, I have been shielding, you're using this as a shield, as opposed to this has been 5 years of going on and I haven't said anything, and it's now impacting the way in which I work, and I've got an HR or an employer who's saying, well, yeah, but you haven't shown up to work for 3 days, or you haven't done this. I guess I'm just curious how any one of you would suggest finding the allies, finding the people within your organization who maybe aren't HR, who aren't at the top, who can help you navigate through this, because it's not a bipartisan issue. It's at the top.
I think specifically if you're in that situation where it is at the top, I think that would be a good question for us to try to dive into a little bit. Is if it's at the top of the organization, what are your options if you've tried going through some of the channels specifically?
I can tell you from my personal experience what I went through. My ally was, and still is, a very good friend, a coworker of mine, and she got me through a lot of hard times, a lot of late nights, and we continued to talk about things in very real terms. And finding that ally can be hard, but it is so worth it. And it was worth it to go outside my comfort zone because I was at such a mental low point that I had to reach out and find someone. I had to get counseling. I needed to get on antidepressants, that type of thing. Again, the continuation of talking about this in real terms, I think is really important so that you can find out who your allies are and who you can turn to, multiple reporting channels, and you can get to know HR better. I don't know if anybody has other advice they'd like to share.
So I think that the specific question around what if the issue is happening at the top of the house, if that's the case, the only remedy that I could see would be going to the board of the company, the chair of the board, written complaints, and then ultimately you have to make a choice, right? So at some point you can only hold people accountable to the degree you're able to. You can only use the channels that you have available, and when they're exhausted, then I think you have to internally reflect and make some decisions that are unfortunate and sad, but ultimately in your best interest. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question around creating allies, and it depends on your company, but one of the things that we find is a really valuable resource in our company is our employee resource groups. So within our diversity and inclusion ecosystem, we have a diversity council, we have employee resource groups, we have a number specifically on this issue of women-focused groups across the organization, not just an employee resource group, but sales, women in sales, and a number of other groups that create an ally network, and they're not exclusive. So any of those forums, you as a man or woman, you can participate in them, and those are great creators of allies and awareness is what we found. Now, recognizing there's all different kinds of businesses here, and some businesses don't have employee resource groups, but that's one of the ways if you could have those, that you could create that ally relationship.
Well, we are just about out of time, and I'm going to give the panelists a chance to give a closing thought. And I realize we have a lot of questions left in the room, of course, and I still have a couple pages here too. And so I wonder if, for the final question, I'll give you a second to think about it, but if you could maybe bring up something that maybe we haven't talked about today, and then leave people with a little bit of a closing thought and something actionable they can maybe take back. So after the event today, our newsroom is going to be putting together content from today's event. We'll have video and photos, and that'll be in our e-newsletters as well. In that, we'll probably also, just because I sense that there's a lot of questions still, what I think would be great is we'll ask for some additional questions that maybe our panelists will be happy to answer at some point, or we can get some other outside experts, because I think there's still a lot of questions that we can address and help on this. If you don't already get our e-newsletters, really simple to sign up. They're free. businessrecord.com/sign up. I'd highly encourage to be on that. That way you stay aware of other events that we're doing, and we'll be, of course, touching on this topic on an ongoing basis. Another one that might be really appealing would be our Lift Iowa e-newsletter. You can sign up at businessrecord.com/liftiiowa. That's our weekly e-newsletter. It's free, again, specifically to address women in leadership and women in business, and trying to foster that growth in that area. Also, a couple upcoming events that you might be interested in too. 90 Ideas in 90 Minutes is back on October 12th. Registration's already open for that. We've got 9 great speakers that are going to be talking about best practices from within their own businesses that they're going to share with you. We'll put that together in a publication. You'll get that at the event. The speakers are going to be great. It's sold out every year that we've done it, and registrations are off to a great start. So you can sign up at businessrecord.com/events for that. And then this is our second to last Power Breakfast. Our last Power Breakfast is on November 29th, and we're working on solidifying the topic for that, so you'll be sure to hear about that once we have that solidified. All right, final question, and Karin, I started with you first, so I'm going to give Tiffany the first one. I saw you sleeping down on the end, so. All right, Tiffany, you're up first.
For just a closing thought, I'll just say, be a good human. I said it before. It's pretty basic, and if you wouldn't want your mother, daughter, sister to be treated that way, then just don't. And this applies to men and women as well.
What advice, you touched on it a little bit, but about making men allies. What advice would you have specifically for some of the men in the room that they could either take back for themselves, but then also potentially pass along to somebody? We know that people are self-selecting to be here today and already have some awareness. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little quick.
Just really quickly, I would say, men need to hear from us as much as we need to hear from them. So if you're curious at all, men are looking for female allies as well. And if you can find a safe place, male-female relationship that's a safe place to have those difficult conversations. I don't want to call it reverse mentoring, but there's a lot we can learn from each other. And until we make it okay to speak about these things to each other, maybe not to a whole group, but one-on-one, I think that's how we're really going to make progress.
The derivative of what Tiffany just shared. And the advice would be to create a forum for courageous conversations in your company. And that advice can be taken big company, small company, create an environment that encourages courageous conversations and create a forum for having.
Kirsten?
I think what we talk about today comes down to power and control and people who wield their power and control inappropriately. And a lot of the rest of what we talked about today is culture change when you boil it down. And it takes time. It's a long road, but it is worth it. It's worth it to have a safe and productive work environment.
Karin?
Yeah, so I think really, as Jon and others have stated multiple times today, this conversation really boils down to what is the underlying culture of your organization, not, whether conduct is legally actionable as sexual harassment. So I think, we all have to do the hard work of assessing what the culture of our organizations is. We can make a lot of assumptions, but it takes work to really get to the bottom of that. And I'd be happy to talk with any of you in great detail about all of the steps you can take to do that, but I'll throw out just a couple. When your organization learns the hard lesson of going through a lawsuit or an administrative complaint, take a look back at that situation and figure out what the organization did right, maybe where there were some missteps, and evaluate how you can do better the next time. I would also add, we have clients who, put out surveys to their workforce so that they can understand whether the policies they have are actually accessible to the workforce, which reporting channels are actually, being used and are perceived as welcoming, and so forth. So there are things you can do to get to that root issue of, what is the culture of my organization and how can it be improved?
Well, that'll do it for us today. Again, my name is Chris Konetsky. I'm the publisher for the Business Record. Our job is to try to help you do business better. And that means if you've got questions and you've got things that could make for good story ideas, especially as it relates to this topic or other topics, really appreciate it if you reach out to me, our newsroom as well. They're going to continue to cover this topic and others going forward. And then finally, can I get a big round of applause for our